So welcome to everyone. Welcome on behalf of me and John. I'm sure John will make his own welcome in a minute. But this is the second of a series of CPD events. And the purpose of these workshops is to take people's understanding of the mental toughness concept to another level. In the first one, this is the second, so in the first one, we explored the 8 factors and the fact that they're independent, and we explored sort of the depth of understanding that we're able to provide to us about the individual's level of mental toughness. And it's not just that. What we found, this is from our own work, but largely through the work of colleague practitioners, that we have been able to understand a lot of common issues in the world of people and organizational development. So today we're going to look at leadership, and I have to say we've got to do it'll almost be a superficial look, but it'll give you an insight into the way that the mental toughness concept can act as a glue, pulling different ideas together to create a comprehensive picture of leadership and motivation, but also how it has its own contribution to make. Now, we've learned something from the first workshop. I think John and I probably spoke for a little bit too long, and the first workshop overran to about an hour and 20 minutes. So what we're going to be doing from now on is restricting ourselves to about 30 minutes to leave you with the opportunity to ask questions and to explore the topic with us. And that's really important. You obviously valued it last time because people kept asking questions until they had to go. So that's a little bit of scene setting. That's going to be the pattern for the future. We've got about another 15 or 16 of these planned, so there's a lot of topics to cover. So we're going to talk about leadership for the 21st century. In our first workshop, we looked at the mental toughness concept and the 8 factors. And I think everybody who is attending today's session is familiar with this, so I can skip doing a little recap on this. What we've noticed in our work, and from the feedback we're getting from colleagues, is that leadership it's never been away from the top of the agenda, but it's really coming back to the top of the agenda. But it's changing in its nature, and it's changing in its focus. What we're beginning to find that in 2023, people are interested in creating resilience and positivity. And doing that, not just so that the organization can thrive, but so that the people in that organization can thrive. There is another development which we like and we embrace, in that we're beginning to see employers finally grasp the idea of intrinsic motivation. It's been very easy in the past to motivate people extrinsically, largely through money and promotions and so on. But there's an understanding that that doesn't last, and it doesn't prevent people from leaving. What does prevent people from leaving, and what does enable them to continue to contribute, is if they enjoy being where they are and think they're doing a purposeful job. And so it's all about creating a sense of control and purpose at every level. And then the other thing that's beginning to come through, and we'll touch upon in a future session, is we're beginning to see an understanding that leaders care about their staff. So they understand their challenges and they support the staff beyond simply setting goals and targets for them. And why are they interested in doing this? Because ultimately, contented staff enjoy what they do and stay longer. And as we see the paradox of increasing labour turnover, this is an important objective for a lot of organisations. But it also translates into the things we always talk about, that's performance and well-being. Now, it's not just me that's rambling on about this. In November, but still this month, the World Economic Forum published a survey of the 10 most important skills for employees. Now, this is the result of a poll of employers all around the world. Now, we can be critical about it because these are not 10 entirely independent skills. A lot of them overlap. But it's interesting to see that leadership and social influence is up there in that list of top 10. But if you look at some of the others, like creative thinking, resilience, flexibility, and agility, that's mental toughness in any other language. Mental toughness is at number 3. So we know that mental toughness is being recognized as something important. When we look at motivation and self-awareness, well, we rabbit on about self-awareness all the time. But motivation is directly linked to leadership. Curiosity, we've got some really interesting stuff coming through about curiosity. And then dependability and attention to detail, empathy, active listening. These are all factors that are heavily influenced and overlap with leadership. So it's not just we who are saying this, it's all employers are beginning to say this. So what we're going to try and do today is we're going to look at how do we actually develop leadership? How do we bring mental toughness into the picture? And we've begun to adopt a very basic, very simple process. Step 1 is diagnosis and reflection. Understand what you've got, and then think about where it might be useful to improve it. Secondly, to look at options. Don't just jump at the first thing you think of. There are lots of different ways and different things you can do, and then translate them into plans and make sure that they deliver. And what we've begun to understand is that if we want to improve leadership, there are 3 big inputs. There could be more. But the first one is leadership. Do we understand what leadership is and the significance of leadership style? We're not going to touch too much on style today. The second input is, do we understand what motivation is, especially intrinsic motivation? And then finally, this is our core interest, mental toughness, the idea of developing resilience and positivity. So I'm going to hand over to John. You've heard me rabbit on for a bit, so you need to hear a different voice.
Thank you very much. And hey, we're all well used to and comfortably familiar with the rabbiting on. We like it. So I know that most people watching this are well aware of how they understand leadership and what definition it is. But largely, any kind of definition of leadership, and there are many, we'll talk about influencing, inspiring, and directing performance towards the achievement of something. Okay. So I think when we think about leadership, it's important to consider it in terms of behaviors, because ultimately the people who follow the leaders, what they observe is behaviors. And one thing we can be pretty sure of from our research is that we're not very good at judging what's going on in someone's head. So someone might have a nice philosophy and think about something, but ultimately, if it's not there in observable behaviors, people don't know that they think that way. So let's think about the core sets of behavior. Purpose, engagement with the individual, and engagement in team working. And we can link this to one of the probably most significant psychological theories of the 21st century in self-determination theory. So self-determination theory by Ed Deci and Richard Ryan, that developed in the 70s and 80s, identifies that humans have basic needs that they strive for, which are autonomy, relatedness, and mastery. When we talk about leadership, we can also think of this first one, which is having purpose, having that kind of direction, okay, which obviously ties in with what we know of leadership and transformational leadership and so on. If we skip it on one, Doug?
Sorry,
Or jump in whenever you want. So let's think about how do those, can you just go forward one?
Sorry.
How do those behaviors become observable? How do we demonstrate them? Well, purpose. So if we're going to demonstrate purpose, it seems pretty obvious, right? But we have to have purpose in what we're doing. And purpose is not we've probably all been on those kind of day-long things where a consultant comes in and a flip chart gets filled out and you come up with visions and missions and those kind of things, right? To inform some kind of strategic plan. And what always strikes me as a little bit hollow on those is that part of, do we really believe that we can do it? And look, when you've got an external consultant coming in and whipping a flip chart out for 3 or 4 hours to come up with a strategy that you're going to adopt for the next 5 years, I don't think it really provides that time to look at whether we believe we can do it. Are they in balance, the purpose and engagement? So if we have good purpose but insufficient engagement, then we'll end up with a lot of disenfranchised folk. Let's think about what would be useful in terms of considering for further development. And if we were to make a difference, what does it actually look like? So we're trying to bring these kind of more abstract, I've got a sense of what I would like to achieve, into what it actually looks like. And then the logical next step, I suppose, is whether you can identify, is it a measurable impact? Any more to add there, Doug? Or
yeah, no, I think it's one of the interesting things is when we first did our first round of research way back in 2005. It was research that was supported by the Institute of Leadership. When we looked at this idea of sense of purpose, one of the things that surprised me a little, but has kind of made sense since, is, and it's got a link with mental toughness, is that the researcher found that sense of purpose was a big source of motivation for many people. And in the sense that if the leadership of an organization had this clear sense of purpose and it was a worthwhile purpose and it excited the employees and the organizations, it would sometimes give employees who didn't have a sense of purpose their own sort of borrowed sense of purpose. And one of the things we found was that this would motivate a lot of employees to the point where they would accept discomfort in pursuit of that sense of purpose. In other words, they would get so excited about something that even if it's created some sort of complication or problem for them, they would still go for it. So this notion of purpose is very, very powerful. And what we've been able to see since, of course, if you sort of connect the idea of deliberate discomfort with purpose, mental toughness also has a relevance there, because our ability to deal with discomfort is a function of our level of mental toughness. That's my 6 pennyworth, John.
great stuff. Should we just move the slide forward?
Oh, yes, sorry.
So let's think about how leadership connects with mental toughness then. So I want to think in particular, those that are familiar with the ILM 72 would be aware of the various components of that. But mental toughness will impact how a leader adopts a certain style, but also how that style is going to be received by the follower. Okay. And if we, just to move quickly enough, if we go on to the next slide, if we think about just as examples, that determination to deliver, that sense of purpose that you have, will link to a lot of the parts of our mental toughness model. Clearly, goal orientation is an obvious one, and that's something that came out in our development from the MTQ 48 to the MTQ Plus, because leaders were continuously talking about purpose. We recognized it wasn't necessarily part of the model, but perhaps should be. Risk orientation, learning orientation, you can pretty much link any of the stuff there to identifying a purpose and believing in that purpose and maintaining that belief in that purpose. Okay. In the early days of creating some kind of vision or purpose or goal, motivation's quite high. And when you're really kind of into something, it doesn't test your mental toughness quite so much. Like when you just come up with a brand new, exciting idea, the most mentally sensitive people will still be really motivated by that, have that sense of purpose. But as we know, progress towards achieving a goal or a purpose is not linear. And you have peaks and troughs along the way. And where mental toughness can help is, do you still continue to believe in and strive for and be motivated by that purpose when things aren't going well? Because at times things won't go well. Okay. Everybody has off days or bad quarters and so on. And the other part that comes from the ILM 72 is around engagement. Think about style of delivery. That kind of, to have a democratic style of leadership as opposed to this kind of autocratic command and control approach can be quite stressful, because when you're in a position of leadership, to hand over the responsibility to other people means that you still tend to keep all the accountability. So I always give lots of sport examples because that's my background, right? And one of the challenges I always see in elite sport is, so I work as a sports psychologist, but I know that if the team lose, no one in the press is calling the sports psychologist or the strength and conditioning coach or the performance analyst to be sacked. Still, it's always the team manager that bears the accountability. And it would be the same in business. So it takes a certain amount of capacity to be able to deal with I suppose, the stress that comes with, I know that I'm going to ultimately be the one that's accountable for this, but by adopting a more democratic style, I'm allowing the responsibility to be taken on by other people. I'm trusting other people to be able to do it. And if we take something like emotional control, for example, like if I don't have sufficient emotional control, it's pretty stress inducing, which means I end up micromanaging people instead. If I don't have that risk orientation, then again, I probably want to keep everything central, and I don't sort of trust the other people, and again, can lead to that kind of like more autocratic or micromanaging. You have anything to add on that one, Doug?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of the people listening will be practitioners and they'll be familiar with sort of more commonly applied models of leadership. And one very popular model that everybody seems to know, at least in the practitioner world, is the Covey model. So if you look at Covey, when he talks about his 7 habits, the first 3 habits are all about purpose. You know, the habits he describes them in terms of have the end in mind. Well, that's about goal orientation. Secondly, believe you can achieve. Well, I would say that's about life control and confidence and abilities. And the third component is do first things first. That's about achievement orientation and the ability to avoid being distracted from your sense of purpose. So what the mental toughness concept can do is give you a lens through which you can understand what leadership's about. And that enables you then, in my belief, to be able to do something about it. And we can do the same with engagement. Covey talks about that as well. But that's just to illustrate how the model can apply to almost any popular leadership model.
Great. Let's move on and talk about intrinsic motivation. So it was kind of it was surprising to me recently that to learn that intrinsic motivation is a kind of a growing concept in the business world. Not surprised, there's some brilliant research behind intrinsic motivation and self-determination theory. Coming from a sport background, by about week 2 of the first year of an undergrad degree, we talk about intrinsic motivation as one of the biggest, most prevalent theories, because intrinsic motivation is when you're doing something as an end in itself, whereas extrinsic means that you're doing something as a means to an end. Okay, so when we do things as kids, you play, whether it's sport or music or just playing with friends, as an end in itself, not because you're striving towards achieving some kind of external reward. But eventually what can happen is the structures outside of that mean that we become more extrinsically motivated. So the example I give from my experience in football academies is seeing all these young lads wanting to play football non-stop. So when before they earn their professional contract, they're being paid £150 a week. We're having to tell them to not go play football with their friends outside of the team because they're not insured. And then they get their professional contract and they get paid their £20,000 a week and £30,000 a week. And, that's a starter before they go on to the real big money. And you meet them a couple of years later and say, oh, can we spend half an hour to go through something? Nah, don't really want to, because their motivation has changed and it's now a job. The reason they're doing something is a means to an end, as opposed to it being an end in itself. Because, and this is a sub-theory of self-determination called cognitive evaluation theory, which started out as something called the over-justification effect in 1971, was that if you add extrinsic motivation, like money and external acclaim, to something that's intrinsic, an intrinsic motivation, you don't get more motivation as a result. What you do is you undermine the intrinsic motivation and you increase extrinsic motivation. So intrinsic motivation, as I say, it's that inherent satisfaction. There's a very good Canadian sports psychologist called Bob Vallerand, who talks about 3 kinds of intrinsic self-determined motivators, which is motivation towards knowledge, accomplishment, and stimulation. So doing something, engaging in something because I love learning more about this, engaging in something because it feels really good to have achieved something. Why do people climb a mountain? There isn't a pot of gold at the top of it, but it's to get to the top and go, God, that feels great. Why do people do a bungee jump? It's for the stimulation. It's just because it feels good to do it. Right? When I'm teaching this to my students, I always say, so obviously they're sat in that lecture at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning because it's just the stimulation of doing it. And I'm sure they would still do it if they didn't get their degree at the end. And then a few of them laugh at that. Okay? So there's a few pillars towards intrinsic motivation linked to basic psychological needs, relatedness, a sense of belonging, feel that I'm part of something, I'm supported. And you can tie in with all the kind of psychological safety discussions that are happening. Autonomy is huge. Autonomy is that sense that I have some control over what I'm doing. And again, think how that links to mental toughness and things like life control. Someone high in life control needs autonomy. And with higher levels of autonomy, you have more kind of like job crafting, where you're able to really excel at the things you really enjoy doing in your job. And mastery is that sense of accomplishment, feeling like I'm good at what I'm doing. And you can tie this in with conceptualizations of flow states, and flow experiences. Like the best kind of experience when you're performing anything is when if I know that I'm good at what I'm doing, I'm motivated to keep doing it. And this is one of the things that strikes me all the time when, again, it probably comes more prevalent in a sport background, but it relates widely. When people aren't doing something, or when they appear lazy to someone, almost every time I talk to that person, I find that actually they don't believe they're that good at it. Because when we know we're good at something, we tend to really like doing it. And when we're not sure that we're very good at something, we tend to want to stop doing it or not put in too much effort, because then at least we can rationalize when we fail at it that, well, we didn't put in too much effort. And then along the way there, we can also add things like purpose, which we've spoken about. And that progress, that sense of, you don't necessarily need to have mastery, but you do want to feel that you're moving towards mastery. And think about how a leader can impact that. It's not necessarily about the end goal, but showing somebody that they are progressing towards something. And the better you get at something, the more enjoyable it can be.
Okay, John. In a way, in the last 18 months, this is a topic that has got me quite excited because it's caused me to reflect. In the first part of my career, I worked for several big international blue chip companies. And looking back, I realized that all the motivation that I experienced was extrinsic. It was all to do with salary, pay, and they would give you better than average pay increases and so on. And those, all of them practiced this curious thing of promotion. So I went to work for one organization that had 12 grades. So you could be a grade 1 to a grade 12 of something. You didn't actually do a different job, but every year you'd get promoted and you'd sort of drift up to being a grade 12, whatever it is. And I realized now that that was quite a lazy way of managing and motivating staff. When I set up in business on my own, I think I can recognize each of these factors as being important for me because I wanted autonomy. I thought I knew what I was doing and I wanted to be able to show people that I've got mastery, and I had a sense of purpose. But the thing is, when I set up on my own, I didn't work with big blue chip companies. I did with some, but most of my work, as most consultants will tell you, is with SMEs. And you come across the people who lead small and medium-sized organizations. And what struck me was how important purpose, autonomy, and mastery was for them. They were much less interested in money than the kind of managers that I would come across in the large blue chip companies. And they would build things and they would create things that and do it at a pace that would be unbelievable in some of the big bureaucratic organizations that I worked in. So I could compare and contrast different settings where different types of motivation would sit. What I really like now is we're beginning to see organizations say, well, the way we've managed people, the way we've tried to motivate people, the way our leadership has practices have been, haven't really delivered the kind of results we want. And people are now beginning to understand that Becky and Ryan came up with something a long time ago that we didn't pay terribly much attention to. And maybe there's something there. I mean, for lots of people, money is important. You need a basic level of money. So there's kind of resonance with Maslow here. But intrinsic motivation, I suspect, is going to be more and more important if we believe that Gen Z and the generations that come after it are less interested in money. They don't want to spend 40 hours a week of their lives or 40 years of their lives doing something just for money. They want to do it for some other more rewarding purpose. So I think, John, we're just running over time a little, but I think it just be worth just touching upon the relationship between mental toughness and intrinsic motivation.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's think about that sense of autonomy there, certainly related to control. So if autonomy is having some kind of agency in how I spend my time, where I put my energies, then it's pretty clear that it's related to control. And I remember I had this job as a head of a department somewhere before. Like the first time I was head of a department in an academic institution, I remember being really surprised by actually, because I always thought the best thing about working in academia was having really high amounts of autonomy. I can, as long as I get the work done, I can choose what work to do and when to do it, and how to do it. But I had a team who were pretty low in control, emotional control and life control, quite sensitive there. And actually, they kind of want me to be told what to do. And I remember being really surprised by that because I think because I would have been quite high in the control elements and I really liked the autonomy, thought that was the good thing about the job. I'd never actually considered that some people actually, unusually, kind of don't want as much. They want some autonomy, but not completely. So having that understanding of the individual means that, yes, on average, autonomy is linked to higher well-being in the workplace and more satisfaction, but not necessarily for everyone. The purpose, as I say, so that's developed with our understanding of commitment. So commitment used to be pretty much what achievement orientation is now. Sticking to a task, given a task, stick to it, a good soldier. Our development that came from feedback practitioners enabled us to develop this aspect of goal orientation because whether people really want to commit to something and stick to it, there's kind of two different types there. You might commit to something because you're just very obedient and you conform to things. But if you're not a conformist, you'll only stick at something if you can see the purpose, see the value in it. So I think there was a huge development for our understanding of how mental toughness actually explains people's behavior in the workplace. The challenge component and our confidence, interpersonal confidence, certainly, but how much we kind of put ourselves out there and confide in other people, links to relatedness. Mastery is obviously linked with the sense of accomplishment, and we know that a primary predictor of confidence is previous success. So having previous successes, that feeling of mastery, that establishment of accomplishment can lead to greater confidence in abilities going forward. So just as a very quick whistle-stop tour to point out a few of the more obvious connections, we can see how there's pretty strong associations between that self-determination, that intrinsic motivation, and mental toughness.
Brilliant, John. I think we're going to skip now to questions because we're already beginning to get questions.
Yep.
So, Tony, what questions have we got so far? And
yes, we have a question from Andrew. Andrew's asking whether this suggests that our motivation, extrinsic or intrinsic, changes as we move through life stages and as our needs change, and if there's any research on this.
There is. So in terms of the extent to which people are intrinsically / extrinsically motivated, it's not a trait as such, but it is what we'd call an orientation, which is like a soft version of a trait. Okay, so some people who are just naturally a little bit more ego oriented, have a little bit more And that's not using ego as a bad word, but naturally have a predisposed to evaluate themselves based on status, tend to be more extrinsically motivated. However, based on the culture and the climates that they're in and what rewards they get, that motivation can become more internalized or less so. So the football example I gave earlier is, if the rewards that people get, and this is something known as cognitive evaluation theory, if the rewards that people get are what's known as controlling rewards, extrinsic rewards, money, like, like if you teach a dog tricks, you sit down, when I say sit, you get a treat. It's an extrinsic controlling reward. The dog knows, if I meet your criteria, then I get what I want in this kind of transaction. So then people externalize their motivation. If we can internalize their motivation, then it moves from being more intrinsic. So it means that the rewards we offer this time are not to control someone, but they might be informational, feedback, learning, those kind of things. So if I give an example from kind of health and physical activity, say, someone might have very little motivation, and the reason that they go to the gym is because their doctor has told them they've got high blood pressure and they have to go and exercise. So they're doing something, it's known as what external regulation is called, because they're told they have to do that in order to avoid a negative kind of consequence. Then in time, they don't need to do it, but they still feel they should because they're paying their gym membership. It's what we call introjected regulation. So they've moved from I must do this to I should do this. And then they actually start enjoying it a little bit. So they start going because they want to do it. But it's a means to an end still, because it's in order to achieve a certain level of, physical health. If a good trainer is able to kind of explain to them what's happening and really engage them in what's happening when you do this kind of exercise, then they become interested in how, and I'm learning about this. And then that's really motivating. So people will then start going and doing the exercise because they're fascinated in how the different kinds of exercise will impact them. Then they're intrinsically motivated. So a good leader, a good coach, a good trainer is able to take someone who's extrinsically motivated, but by offering informational rewards, you start to internalize that motivation. So the motivation switches from what do I get out of this to what can I learn and understand about this. And then it becomes that kind of more internalized, which that's so much more robust. People can come and go and that kind of motivation will stay. So a long answer, but hey, I think it's a fascinating topic, so I can talk about it all day.
Andrew, I think there might be another dimension to your question, because I suspect the balance of motivation does change as you go through life, but that might be a function of you learn what motivates you and what excites you. But I think another factor might be, if you're 20, you've been heavily influenced by parents and often educators. And I'm really interested to see how often universities will publish data about their university courses saying 88% of people who get a degree here gets a job within 6 months, and the average salary is 25% above the norm. When you're young, you've been told quite often that extrinsic motivators are important and somehow valuable. You don't really have enough advice and guidance to steer you in any other direction. So I suspect a lot of people set off thinking money's important, promotion's important, the ability to be this or that is important. And as they set off and sort of do jobs and get on with their career, they begin to realize other things are important. I suspect that might also be a factor.
Yeah, and I think that ties in with that sense of, when I mentioned that ego orientation there, it if you're within that culture of what does success look like, and if it's status as measured by income and how flash your car is and those kind of things, then you've got a long way to go to move towards a more kind of intrinsically rewarding perception of success.
So Tony, what next question?
Yeah, Anthony's asked quite a similar question to Andrew, just around generational differences and preferred style of motivation, whether there are differences or just expectations have moved on. I don't know if you have anything else to add to that. I think we've been kind of answering that as we've been going along as well.
Well, I'll kick off with that because this is a conversation that John and I have had many times. So as everybody knows, I'm quite ancient and I started work a long, long time ago. And when I took my first job, I was sent on a course at what is now, well, it's one of the universities in Newcastle. It was Rutherford College, and it was a leadership program, but it wasn't about leadership at all. It was entirely about the prevailing theory of leadership and management, which was scientific management. That was the F.W. Taylor theories. And the underlying principle in F.W. Taylor's thinking, which most companies adopted, was if I tell you clearly enough what I expect from you, I expect obedience. And obedience was actually a word that was very commonly used. So I would say all the way through to maybe the turn of the century, I would see that. And in fact, I still see a lot of this Taylorism around. And when you think about where did job descriptions come from? Well, there were statements of this is what I expect from you. And, you know, even in those early days, I thought job descriptions were a stupid idea. And yet we still see people creating job descriptions, lists of tasks you're supposed to produce, which are out of date and irrelevant the minute it's published. So, you know, if the prevailing ethos in society is one of obedience and do as you're told, and it could get away with that because you think about the education levels then. I mean, believe it or not, only 4% of people went to university when I went to university. Now it's 50%. You've got a generation of people with, or generations going through with entirely different expectations. You had 96% of the population when I started work who really had no expectations other than doing a job that they were being told to do. So I think there is a kind of generational influence, and hopefully it's a positive one.
Yeah, what with the plague being around as well, that was tough, wasn't it?
Tony, next question.
Yeah, we have a question from Nazreen. So Nazreen says, you have mentioned Covey's model. Are there any other models we can refer to?
Well, it's a good question, Nazreen, because when we did that original work, we worked with a young researcher called Nolig Heffernan. She's now in Ireland working as a consultant. And one of the first things she did is went and did a survey of all the popular leadership models. And she found about 50 different leadership models that were in popular use around the world. And that included Covey, included John Adair's action-centered leadership model, included the situational leadership models. It's hard to know who to attribute those to. But she also found a whole pile of academic models. And most people in the practitioner world don't know anything about these sort of more theory-based models. And probably the best or most effective one is Fiedler's model of leadership. And there was a guy called House who worked alongside Fiedler. They began to understand these ideas of purpose and so on. So if you look at virtually any model, you will find the same underlying themes. And in fact, that was the purpose of knowledge research. We were commissioned by the Institute of Leadership to explore why there were so many different leadership models and were they connected in any way. And what knowledge found was, yes, they were connected because they were all basically the same model. There were just variations on a theme or different ways of expressing things. So if you look at any leadership model that you come across, Nasreen, just look at it carefully and say, is it talking about purpose? And is it talking about engaging with the individual? That's making sure that the individual is switched on to deliver the purpose. And is it engaged with team working? And team working here is not about my team. Team working is talking about the idea that I'm part of a community. And that's the bit that most organizations miss when they look at leadership and motivation. The idea of we're all one team, we should all be collaborating. We might have to self-sacrifice to help each other out. So basically, if you go and look at virtually any leadership model, you'll find the same underpinning principles.
Well, one of the things I would always encourage people to do is look for research in different domains. So what's quite funny is when I talk to people in business, I give loads of examples of sport-based models because, in sport, people are performing under pressure and you kind of have to, obviously, you can't be successful in team sports without being a team. And then when I go into sport, I look at a lot of business-based literature because, they're kind of, they've been more exposed to some of the other stuff. Equally, when you go into education, so look in different domains because what tends to happen is people always work within their own domain. And if you look at leadership models or sort of team cohesion models in business, in sport, in military, in education, they're quite different. And actually, probably a good way to learn is to look at those. If you look at all of them within business, you go, geez, these are all the same. So I think just look at domains that have nothing to do with what you're looking at, because you might find something different by doing it that way. So do a search and put in education, sport, military. Find something that's, might be a little bit left field to kind of get you thinking about things.
Okay, so Jim is interested in the inclusion agenda and neurodiversity in the workforce. He's seen a lot of poor leadership failing to recognise different motivations and ways of thinking and communicating with neurodiverse. Is there much research in this area?
I don't know.
Are you talking about research that embraces the mental toughness concept? I suspect you are. So.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's probably a pretty significant gap there. I do know that there are a lot of people, researchers that are interested in the area, and I think there is a lot of research happening, but conception of a research idea through to publication is kind of several years. So I would hope that will be a kind of burgeoning area in the next sort of 3 to 5 years. But I probably wouldn't be best placed to I wouldn't be a font of knowledge in that, I'm afraid.
Jim, it's a question that is increasingly being asked, and I think we have been aware about the relevance of the mental toughness concept for diversity and inclusion for some time, because the diversity and inclusion agenda tends to be very narrowly focused. It can be focused on skin color, it can be focused on your beliefs, it can be focused on gender, but probably the most fundamentally important aspect of diversity and inclusion is what you just captured in your question. You don't think like I think, and we can explain that. So we can look at somebody who's got a low level of say, life control, and somebody who's got a high level of life control, and we can understand why they don't see things from the same perspective and how they might reject each other. And that obviously is going to be harmful to a diversity and inclusion agenda. So I guess there must be potential for research, and it's probably quite an important and valuable area of research to embrace. The trick now is to find somebody that is going to pick the baton up and run with it. And funnily enough, we've just had an inquiry from somebody in Australia along those lines. Whether we can turn that into this kind of research that's relevant to this topic it remains to be seen. But it's a gap. But there are lots of gaps. When you look at the mental toughness concept, we've really only been out there with the 8-factor model for about 5 years, and it's just applying to so much.
Yeah, it's a great question, because you think with the increased recognition of neurodiversity, it's only become a bigger aspect of leadership. It's got me thinking that though, Jim. So if I get a chance, I'll have a little look on the databases at work, and if I find some stuff, I'll send it on.
Yeah, appreciate that, because where I've seen it is and I've seen it being incredibly destructive. It's where you've got a leader who isn't self-aware enough to actually realize that there is a difference, and it rapidly escalates into grievance, and then it escalates into exits, tribunals, etc., and it can destroy a team very, very quickly.
Yeah. No, it's a huge issue, and as I say, one that I can only really see becoming a bigger consideration, because one of the things you see in schools now, which is fantastic, and I certainly see it with university students, more neurodiverse students at university that probably would not have been going to just university in the past. So they're going to be entering graduate level jobs, and I think for that reason, I would expect the amount of neurodiverse people in the workplace to drastically increase as time goes on. But also, there's always been neurodiverse people in the workplace. It's just that it's just not been acknowledged. So I think with greater acknowledgement of it as well, it's an issue that's only going to warrant more consideration as time goes on. So yeah, I'm very interested in that. I'll look that up later.
Tony?
Just backtracking a little bit, a question from Andrew, whether we can direct him to the research article on leadership models. So I think that was to do with Nasreen's question.
Yeah, so it's not actually a research article. It's her dissertation for her PhD. She never got round to publishing it anywhere, but we've got a copy of that dissertation, and I'm sure we can share that with you.
And just one final comment from Paul. Says probably one for a future session, but I would be interested to understand how MTQ has been used to help people develop gravitas. And I think that's about it. I think I've covered everybody's questions and comments.
It's interesting. So, Paul, you can unmic. What do you mean by gravitas?
So this has come up with a couple of people that I'm working with at the moment, Doug, who are at a certain level in their organizations where, there might be sort of 300 people or so at that level, and then to get to move up a level, the 300 suddenly becomes 30, right? So the competition for promotion is huge, and one of the areas where a couple of the leaders have identified development needs in their people is around how they manage themselves, particularly when they're around very strong personalities and strong leaders, and almost how they start to own a room and own a session, because for some people it's it is putting quite a lot of fear into them. And what I've noticed in one of the MTQ reports for one of those people is there was low scores on learning orientation and lower scores on risk orientation. Right. And then when we looked at confidence in abilities, there was some areas where she was very confident in her abilities, but areas where, on a bit of exploration, there were issues where you could see that she was lacking courage in her convictions. Right. And I'm sure this probably isn't uncommon. So I'd just be really interested if others have used the outputs of MTQ to really help drive those conversations.
Well, I think the mental toughness questionnaire would be, I don't think I've come across the term gravitas, but you've given us a feel for what you mean. But I think that's a common issue. If people have got to step up to another level, put it crudely, have they got what it takes to move to another level? And you can identify the challenges that might exist at a higher level that don't exist at your own level. And you can use the mental toughness concept to kind of assess whether that person's underlying personality, their mental approach would support that move to another level. So you've actually already done your analysis. All 8 factors may be relevant in one way or another, but of course it'll vary from individual to individual. So I would have thought, things like risk orientation, being prepared to be that little bit bolder, being prepared to look over the horizon, being prepared to take risks is something that is increasingly required as you go up the organization. I would have thought interpersonal confidence would be something that would be pretty significant. In fact, I'm grappling with a situation right now with an organization where somebody's got an incredibly low level of interpersonal confidence but wants to be the chief executive. So it's very difficult to kind of be able to engage with and influence a lot of other people if deep down inside you're not convinced you can do it. And things like life control, a sense of self-worth, confidence and abilities, they'll all play their part, as will goal orientation, that sense of purpose. And we spoke about it earlier in leadership, that it's incredibly important. It really does get the attention of people around you. If you work with a sense of purpose and you have very clear goals and valuable goals and purposeful goals, and you move purposefully towards them, people do pay attention to you. I would suspect that's a component of gravitas as well.
Yeah,
I don't know whether you'd add anything, Peter. Oh, sorry, John.
There we go. Yeah, no, I think it's interesting, and I think if you remember that the different components of the model are, on average, not for every person, but on average, positively correlated with one another. So goal orientation is positively correlated with things like life control and confidence in abilities. And I think you can link that to the idea of like your self-image. Like, so is that someone who's high in life control, confidence in abilities and goal orientation, I think perhaps finds it easier to have, they can see themselves in that higher position. They kind of see themselves as belonging there, which kind of means you're less racked with that doubt as to whether, do I really belong here? How much am I winging this? Which are linked to Doug recently wrote a blog on imposter phenomenon, as I always call it. So what's always called imposter syndrome, the original piece never mentioned the word syndrome, because why would you try and medicalize something that's not a medical term? But anyway, and there'd be a lot of stuff in like the EDI literature as well about how often the difference between one of the factors that explains why there's fewer women in higher level positions is not because they think they're less able to, but they're probably on average just a little bit more humble and higher in what's described as the imposter phenomenon. So yeah, I think it ties in with mental toughness, because once people have that you can link all the factors, but certainly some of them where you think if you're higher in those, it's easier to have a self-image where you see yourself as that's kind of where you belong, which means when I put myself in that position where it's highly competitive, I'm less likely to be looking at other people and trying to sort of rank myself relative to the room that I'm in, because it's not as fatalistic as seeing it as destiny or anything like that, but that position that someone's in, that's where I believe I belong. I can see myself doing that, and I know I can do it. Means that that's where your focus goes, rather than on, do I belong there? Or what about that person? What about that person? And then you have a lot more questions and start backtracking that way. But yeah, I think certainly from a practical consideration, I think it's a huge topic. I love the kind of sense when you see someone going through an organizational levels when they get to the point of what they thought was winging it, they kind of realize that's what everyone does. And that's so I do belong. And one of the things I get my sports teams to do is I'll get the most senior players in the team to talk about. I did this last year with a team where one of the senior players was talking about like their self-doubts, their worries, the questions they ask themselves in front of the whole group. And then one of the young players who just come through the youth team, and it was his first season on the senior team, came to me afterwards and said, wow, like until a couple of years ago, I had a poster of that guy on my bedroom wall. But now I know that he thinks like that. I sort of think, oh, well, that's normal. It's okay. I can think like that. It's not that I have self-doubts, therefore I don't belong. I have self-doubts, and do you know what? Everyone else does. So I think that kind of awareness as well can be really helpful.
Well, I think we've managed to keep time a little bit better. I think we've come to the point where you and I can stop winging it, John.
I'll never come to that point.
So what there are lots more of these CPD sessions. We're going to just leave you with a teaser. There's a post gone out today on innovation, and it's picking up on, we're just going to touch upon the headlines here. And it'll be something that we'll pick up in future sessions. And it gives you an illustration of the things that we're beginning to discover and the things that you need to know. So John has just done a bit of analysis on the relationship between innovation and mental toughness. And in 30 seconds, John, what did that tell us?
It tells us that mental toughness predicts innovation, and people that are higher in mental toughness tend to perceive themselves as being more innovative. People who are more mentally sensitive perceive themselves as being less innovative. But interestingly, there's certain factors within the model that are much stronger predictors. I can't remember which ones they were, Doug.
Well, there were four that were strong predictors, but the interesting thing is there's a confound. There was a negative correlation between innovation and life control, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. So, and we're trying to understand that, but I suppose if you think of like that's on average of what 1,300 people. So it's not to say that everybody with high life control is not innovative and vice versa or anything like that. But on average, there was a small negative relationship there, because if we think about mental toughness in the sense of stress, like things like innovation and creativity, those kind of things, they actually make the world less certain. So perhaps if you're not particularly confident, but you're lower in life control, then you probably don't. things are more controllable if they're simple, right? So it's kind of just easier to not come up with new things, or perhaps you get a little bit rigid in the way that in the way that they see in the world. They like things to be manageable, and perhaps that leads to it. I can't remember exactly. I wrote it a long time ago.
A little bit like looking at, responding to the question on diversity and inclusion. Just about, I mean, every now and again, and it's more frequently than we ever imagined we would, we're beginning to find these little nuances and these little things popping out and saying, well, what does this mean? And it might mean something significant. I mean, the people who get to the top of an organization tend to be those people with higher levels of life control. Are they the people who encourage, or do they somehow negatively impact on innovation? That's a question to be answered yet. So I think we've come to the end. Thank you for all your questions. And we look forward to sharing our thoughts with you with the next session.
Great. Thanks, everyone.